Well, hi everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. I know that the title of this talk was a little obscure. I really hate having to title talks in advance because I kind of like to just sort of vibe into where I'm at, where people are at, and then kind of like go from there, rather than having a formulated thing in advance. Although ultimately they always kinds of circles around the same themes and topics and anecdotes, all that stuff. So I don't know why I'm so persnickety about that. But yeah, so thank you very much, Maria, for inviting me. Yeah, Maria and I became friends in Toulouse, which was really nice, where I was living for a while during the pandemic. And yeah, so a lot of my work, I guess, I started as an investigative journalist. I became more of a kind of philosopher, explorer of consciousness, and so on. Yeah, the work keeps changing. I've written a number of books. Now a big part of my work is a newsletter where I'm like thinking all the time. In fact, I got very inspired with an idea the last few days. I was waking up at like 6 a.m. and working on that. Yeah, I sort of give myself permission to think about everything that's going on and to dive in with research and investigations and so on. So just to tell you about myself, my name is Daniel. I'm 58. I was born in New York City. My parents were artists. My dad was an abstract painter. My mother is still alive as a writer. She was a book editor. She was involved with the Beat generation in the 50s, if people know about the Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and so on. So I grew up in this sort of counterculture, artsy milieu, but there wasn't really an idea of spirituality or mysticism or anything like that. Everyone was kind of ultimately materialist. People had rejected the religions of their parents and grandparents and so on. And really, I didn't know anybody who had a religious belief or even a mystical belief growing up. It was New York in the 70s and 80s, very skeptical, very atheist, very secular. And I ended up dropping out of college. I started working in magazines. I was writing fiction and poetry and so on. And I don't know, I just ended up getting into a sort of existential crisis around there being no meaning to life in a weird way. And my assumption was that consciousness was entirely based in the brain, and that when we passed away, that was it, like total annihilation of self or identity or subjectivity or anything like that. I mean, out of curiosity, so that's still in a way like one of the main paradigms of modern civilization, right? So how many people would define themselves in that way as somebody who's like a materialist, believes that consciousness is entirely based in the brain and couldn't possibly, there couldn't possibly anything like a soul or spirit after death? Anybody toggle more towards materialism? Really? Okay, we got a non-materialist audience. That's super interesting. Okay, cool. Yeah, because even what's that? Well, yeah, but even so, I find that a lot of people, or even they hold some. What's that? 15% You're 15%. Anybody 30%? 45? Can I hear like 50? 50%. What's that? 50. Who's got 55? Who's got 55? Up there. Okay. 60. Yeah. So yeah, but I think there's an interesting way which I want to talk about a little bit, because I'm thinking a lot about I've been part of this sort of Burning Man, like transformational, neo-psychedelic, kind of neo-animist, kind of part indigenous worshiping culture, for 20 years now. And as time has gone, I began to have more and more struggles with it, and I'm really feeling that this culture maybe needs to take another step forward, that actually that's becoming more and more like urgent. As we see what's happening in the world all around us. And also, yeah, maybe, in what I'm talking about today, I'm not going to, totally maybe not talk about what nobody wants to talk about, which is Trump, despotism, fascism, all that kind of stuff that's happening on more this bigger picture that is odd and freakish in a way. But anyway, so I was a secular materialist, scientific materialist, and then I got interested in psychedelics, which I tried in college, and I ended up going to Africa, to Iboga, with the Bwiti. Anybody here take Iboga? Cool. With the Bwiti, or just in more like a Mexican clinic or Costa Rican? Yeah. I worked with Ayahuasca in Ecuador with an indigenous culture called the Secoya. I'm sure many people here have done ayahuasca in the jungle or out of the jungle. Yeah. And so that was an incredible culture. I was very privileged because a lot of the elders had been, they'd grown up contact, and they still had a very like original vibe. And there was a culture that was also quickly vanishing. I think there was like 20,000 of them in the beginning of the 20th century. And by the time I went, there was about 750 of them left, living between these two communities. And they were being, a lot of attrition due to the effects of the oil companies and the missionaries and so on. And the culture still survives, and I haven't been there for a while, but friends are actually saying there's having a little bit of resurgence, even though all of the elders that I worked with have passed away. That was in the late 1990s. That was a very spectacular, very special culture. If you go through the Amazon, it's like there's the different indigenous cultures which do ayahuasca differently. And for them, the Shipibo are considered kind of like the healers, the doctors of the Amazon. The Secoya were more like I can't even say, like avant-garde, Gnostic jazz musicians of the Amazon or something. They would they had a ceremonial lodge, and everyone would lie in a hammock, and they would drink ayahuasca. They would do this for months, every night during one season of the year. And they would sing the sort of spirit language and talk to the heavenly people and so on. And they would check in with each other in their language. They would stop the ceremonies every now and then. They'd be like, "Are you seeing like the blue heavenly people?" And the other ones would be like, "Yes, yes, I am." So they would all know they were on the same kind of like starship, like going into these interstellar dimensions and realities. It was a very, incredible tradition. Still my favorite, actually. And they also said that sometimes they would have, amazing things would happen that, for them were quite ordinary. They said that sometimes, let's say somebody in the community would be sick, and they would pray all night and sing all night, and in the morning the lead shaman would look down at his palm, and he would have like a seed or a new plant would be in his hand, and they would plant the seed, and that would be a medicinal plant that would cure that illness that the person in the community had gotten. And once again, I kind of always note, more like people in the empirical, rational world are very skeptical of all sorts of claims, and sometimes things are exaggerated and so on. But the way they said that, I was kind of like, I kind of think that did happen. And I always kind of registered just how people talk about extraordinary things. And sometimes you can feel there's sort of like a truth quotient there, just a simplicity to how people talk about this stuff. I mean, just last week, actually, I talked to somebody about an extraterrestrial, or not even extraterrestrial. They had an experience where they were in a house in Germany, and this strange being just like popped into their reality and had these sort of like Gumby-like arms, was long and thin, and kept like popping in and out into different rooms. And just the way this person was talking about it, I was like, I think this happened to this person. Like these things do kind of happen. How many people here, I thought this could be something we could talk about in the workshop a little bit. How many people here have had, extrasensory perception experiences or psychic paranormal experiences or interdimensional experiences? Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's going to be helpful and interesting to surface that more, and bring it up more. So a few things. And then I also began to have a number of these kind of experiences that I wrote about in the books, and some were too kind of weird even to write about. Or sometimes you find if you have an extraordinary experience, like writing about it or sharing it almost like attenuates the force of it or something, or the energy, especially when people are not like ready for it, not ready to receive it in a way. So ultimately I wrote my first book, Breaking Open the Head, which was on psychedelic shamanism. And the book really did chart, in the end, my transition from kind of a materialist to, having had a number of psychic and shamanic experiences, I guess kind of a Jungian and so on. And at that point, I got very interested in this idea that, indigenous knowledge systems, were of great value. And not that, I think sometimes we make the mistake of maybe romanticizing or sentimentalizing them. It's not like they're perfect or anything, but in some ways they knew different things about the nature of reality that modern Western civilization had lost, as we shifted from, let's say, a holistic, integrated left-right brain kind of system to being very left brain dominant, very focused on the rational, on the empirical, on the, anything that could be quantified or known scientifically and so on. So then I began to wonder about these indigenous knowledge systems and what they had to say about our world today, and I discovered that a number of them, quite a bit of them, have sort of prophetic foretellings or ways of understanding this time that we're in, and in particular, I got interested in the Mayan calendar and the Hopi prophecies and the Aztec prophecies. And I got very interested in Terence McKenna's ideas and Jose Arguelles' ideas. I mean, now, so in 2008, 2007, I published a book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, that was a bestseller at that time. And it's probably the achievement I'm most proud of, where I kind of put together all these different ways of looking at this prophetic knowledge system. And trying to propose what it was about. It's sort of ironic. I feel like if that book had come out, if it had been the Mayan calendar had pointed to 2025, nobody would have an argument, that this was going on. Like we can see with artificial intelligence, with the collapse of the ecosystems, with so many things that are happening right now. I think we have a sense that we're just, there's some kind of metamorphosis happening of human society and culture and consciousness that I think was already, starting, let's say, in 2012, if not sooner, but seems to be sort of crescendoing in our time. Does that feel true to people here? Do they kind of respond to that in some sense? Okay. So yeah, so I was never like dogmatic about the year 2012, even though I used that as the title of the book, and it was used kind of to put me down when nothing happened in 2012. Never said anything specifically would happen. It was more like, the Mayan calendar was a 5,125 year cycle. That began 3,100-ish years ago, and it was almost like a kind of a doctor, looking at a pregnancy and potential birth, and being kind of like, okay, the baby may be born around this day, around that day, but somewhere in that time, So whatever they understood, which is still not like entirely clear what they understand, it seems like we're in that process of this kind of metamorphosis or transformation of human consciousness, human society, and so on. And the reason I gave this talk the title of the sixth sun in particular was because of a Aztec shaman, Sergio Magana, who wrote a book called The Age of the Sixth Sun, I believe. So he made differentials between the Mayan understandings and also the ways that like Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles talked about them, which I think are all still very relevant and fascinating and worth reviewing. But he had a slightly different perspective based on his teachers in the Aztec tradition. So for them, they talked about it. Also, these are kind of like, I guess metaphorical or mythological structures, and we'll talk later about how to kind of look at those in a way that doesn't necessarily contradict or violate the scientific worldview or the empirical worldview. I think there's a way to build a bridge that's really important right now. But so just to give you the outline of the idea, according to Sergio Magana, so these different cycles of the suns, which are like 5,125 year cycles, or what the Hopi talk about as the worlds, like the fourth world. They say we're transitioning to the fifth world. For the Aztecs, these suns represent a polarity between they call suns of light and suns of darkness. So the last 5,000-ish years, we've been in a sun of light. And during that time, as we can see, like empiricism, rational, waking consciousness, daylight, clarity have been kind of the predominant like tonalities of human consciousness. We've learned how to interact with and say manipulate and maybe control and exploit the physical world. We've learned more and more about the physical universe through science and investigation and so on. But we sort of neglected, let's say, like the inner world, the psychocosmos, so in that process. And as we transition into this sixth sun, the sun of darkness, Magana argues that the sort of predominant tonality of consciousness shifts towards the psyche and the dream world. So reality itself becomes in sort of slow degrees more and more dreamlike, and that also allows for it has both in good and bad qualities. It allows for faster and faster manifestation of the psyche, but that can also be very dangerous because if you don't know what is in your shadow side, your unconscious, the stuff that you manifest can turn out to be very, very destructive. So I feel that's really something that we're seeing around us right now in the sort of accumulation of capital and the increasing power of technology and artificial intelligence, in deep fakes and so on. It's getting, reality is becoming more and more dreamlike, and it's becoming harder and harder to have a kind of objective, whatever that means, truth-centered perspective on what's happening on so many levels. Does that people respond to that? Does that kind of make sense in a way? Yeah. Cool. Yeah. I mean, so, as I said, I recommend Jose Arguelles' perspective. He was a kind of, so both Jose and Terence were kind of like these psychedelic visionaries in the 70s who exploring LSD, mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT, and so on. And they had these visions that, what was that? I missed that.
He's like mushrooms.
Exactly. Thanks for that. Yeah, any like childlike exclamations are always more than welcome. And so they both beamed into in their different ways this connection to the Mayan calendar and these cycles that ended in 2012. I mean, McKenna developed the idea of the singularity or the eschaton. How many people here have like spent some time marinating in McKenna's like nasal voice and his audio? Yeah, if you have some time to spare, just pick up some of his stuff on YouTube, listen to some of the audio. It's extremely entertaining. So he talked about this sort of, both of them kind of talked about in different ways that we were sort of speeding up and that there was going to be kind of this exponential acceleration that Terence McKenna talked about as the singularity or the eschaton. Arguelles had a less technological idea around this. He actually thought we would move to a post-technological society that was based on telepathy, where we would activate something called the noosphere. People hear about the noosphere as an idea? Noosphere, yay, no, yes, no. Who knows about the noosphere? Okay, so that the noosphere is basically this idea that originally formulated by a Catholic paleontologist and mystic, Teilhard de Chardin, that there's a sort of movement naturally happening where we have the biosphere, just organic life on Earth. Then humans developed, and we've developed technologies. We've been reshaping, resculpting the Earth, and you could call that the technosphere. Now we've put highways and satellites around the Earth. We're shaping the Earth to human purposes, right? That's kind of like what we do. But that ultimately, that whole building of this layer of technology could actually just be kind of like the ladder or the kind of necessary kind of interlude, let's say, to reach another layer of existence, which I just got bit, which Teilhard de Chardin and Arguelles talked about as the noosphere. So nous is the Greek word meaning mind. So the idea that there's like there's a sort of thought envelope around the Earth that we're constantly feeding into with our thoughts, but ultimately the whole thought sphere of the Earth becomes activated. And we could see the internet as a kind of electronic noosphere, although at the moment it's obviously not giving us the best that it could give us in many respects. Bug? Yeah. Ooh. It's funny, interesting actually, this has been a new phenomenon. I gave a talk in England, and like a minute before I gave the talk, a bee stung me. Like, I think on my lips, actually. Yeah, it's so interesting, huh? Yeah, I think it is good. It's painful, but good. What's that? It's fascinating, yeah. But that's twice in a row, never any other time. All right, I'm getting bee juice, I guess. Anyway, yeah, so that's just another way to think about it, that maybe actually what seems like an accidental, kind of messy, cacophonous process is actually the necessary, inevitable evolutionary process where humanity is forming like a global like hive mind or global state of being, which seems very disturbing to us. We're so used to this idea of like individuality and kind of like things, individual expression being so important. But there's no reason not to think that in our relationship with the Earth, we're not also doing something as organic as, let's say, fetal development leading to birth, right? Like, in a way, like the way we've created, highways and satellites. It's kind of like in the way, like in the brain of a developing fetus, the neurons and the synapses start developing, and then there's the possible for sort of global coherent thought and so on. So it could be that we're actually still in an organic evolutionary process, and as we see throughout nature, organic and evolutionary processes are exquisitely timed. So it may not be so much that we're just, on this sort of random happenstance, that it could be that something else is happening through us or with us as it's like catalytic agents, in the same way the cells in our body, work together to form a whole. So that's kind of the noosphere idea, and Jose Arguelles' idea is that, we're, as we reach this next level of consciousness, and I have to admit, I was much more sold on this, believing this was going to happen like 10 years ago. Although as I speak about it now, I feel a certain optimism again, which is nice. That somehow we would develop this telepathic noospheric capacity, and then we would realize that a lot of the technology that we're creating is unnecessary. We would strip some of it down, and we would go into a sort of telepathic seances, using psychedelics to advance consciousness, tantra, and so on. We would master the forces of eros and chi and so on, towards sort of guarded utopias, which is a little bit what was being spoken about today by Murat. Is that your name? Murat, yeah. But Terence McKenna was more on the sort of idea of an instrument, like the singularity would be the ultimate merging of humanity and technology through some kind of like device or something. And that idea has become very, very powerful in the tech world. People heard about Singularity University, what's happening maybe on a big stage right now is the sort of technological accelerationists. There's a movement called effective accelerationism that wants to just push at technology as fast as we can, as far as we can, for various reasons. And so in a way, they're the ones who have worked with MAGA to kind of like seize the reins of the U.S. government. With the goal of bringing about artificial superintelligence, life extension for those individuals lucky enough to have the wealth to be immortalized, and then also the sort of conquest of Mars as a potential vision, and other planets. I'm sure a lot of people here have been doing some research and thinking about what happened, how did Elon Musk become the sort of sudden controller of America in some strange way. It's worth doing a deep dive into his background, which I've been doing a little bit on the newsletter. His grandfather actually in Canada was part of a political movement called Technocracy, Inc. And they had a vision of the future of the world where there would be no democratic elections. There would be rule by scientists and engineers. And the world would be split between three, I think they called them technorates, each one with its own kind of like dictator, emperor. And they would be kind of the American technorate, the Eurasian one, and the Asian technorate. What's that? This was back in the 30s. Actually, they were. Yeah, for sure. Well, then the Canadian grandfather couldn't get this idea moving, so then he moved. Then he liked apartheid, so he moved to South Africa to support that. But anyway, yeah. In a way, it seems like Musk is trying to become the emperor of the North American technate in his vision, and this would ultimately be. It was interesting for me learning about this political movement and maybe the ideals behind it. Very early on, after getting elected, Trump has been saber rattling and saying maybe we're going to grab Greenland, maybe we're going to annex Canada, maybe we're going to go to Mexico, maybe we're going to get Panama Canal back again, and this would all totally make sense with this technate idea that essentially, the goal of the American technate was to unite, the whole continent, maybe down through Central America, and then essentially would be able to use those resources to accelerate artificial intelligence and artificial superintelligence to bring about these other goals. Any questions about that or thoughts about that? What's that? That's clear, right? Yeah. Then it's also, I don't, because I haven't spoken to many of you, been a little bit reclusive. I don't know where people are at the whole like political, economic spectrum here. It's fascinating what's happening with crypto, kind of like the attempt to instantiate crypto as like a real thing. Whereas, as much value as Bitcoin gains, ultimately Bitcoin is simply a speculative asset class. They're like, as my friend Brett Scott says, numerical nouns that have no intrinsic value. And their value is only in relationship to other currencies like the U.S. dollar. So this effort to swing a lot of wealth, and also because of the way Bitcoin was formed in like 2008, 2009, it was certain group of white, somewhat Aspergerish, technologically advanced men who amassed like a huge amount of Bitcoin. So they're of course pushing very hard, because all Bitcoin is in a way is a marketing scheme to increase the value of Bitcoin because it's of tremendous value to them. Whereas if like a relatively modest person now tries to buy like some Bitcoin, that's okay. But if somebody got there early and owns like 1,000,000, 100,000 Bitcoin, the more you invest into it, and it's kind of like any scheme like this, they kind of need to keep bringing new people into it, So the sort of speculative and kind of like nonsensical in a weird way, value of Bitcoin. And I'm not even saying, I mean, I'm tempted to buy Bitcoin right now because it probably is going to go up if these guys get into power in the short term anyway. In the more longer term, it also seems to be part of this control agenda on the part of the sort of techno crypto elites. It could end up, who knows, because it's so speculative, ending up something like the 2008 subprime mortgage crash, where you have a very inflated and speculative asset that goes up and up, and then suddenly the shares are pulled away and the whole thing collapses back down. So those are some of the ways that I've been thinking about things. But for me, like the most important thing right now is to arrive at a coherent ontology. And the word ontology is, basically means like how we relate to the nature of being itself. And there's like, three main ontologies that we have on offer right now. I mean, maybe there's four, we can talk about it. But one of them is reductive materialism. And nobody here is a reductive materialist. We determined that. Or maybe somebody's like 15%, 30%. So we all believe that consciousness is more interconnected, more woven into the fabric of reality. But I think what's really important in a strange way is to go fully deep into that understanding, which requires a sort of intellectual fortitude, like discipline, research, reflection, and investigation. So the other two, sort of major, sort of coherent ontologies. One is panpsychism, which is basically argues that everything in the universe, there's still a dualism, but everything in the universe on some level possesses mind-like attributes, like this pole, or obviously the trees or whatever. So that's and then the third ontology, which is the one that I'm advocating for, is called monistic or analytic idealism. And I think it's not the greatest name, unfortunately, but essentially the argument of idealism is that consciousness is actually the ontological primary, which absolutely makes sense when we think of our own experience, because in fact every experience we have is through consciousness. And even the idea that they're physical things or separate things is actually just an inference we draw through consciousness itself, right? So consciousness is actually the fundamental ground of our being. And we also know that things can arise in consciousness, as when we go to sleep at night and we have a very lucid dream, a whole world arises with characters and with people and so on. And so basically the monistic or analytic idealist idea is that is the nature of reality itself. The primordial basis of reality is consciousness, and the whole universe arises from consciousness, just as a dream arises from the sleeping mind. And that consciousness that is the sort of instinctive, underlaying field or source or whatever, seems to have an innate curiosity, or at least an innate dispensation to know itself, to discover itself, to discover its creative capacities, to play and to create. And in order to do any of that stuff, it can only do that if it created separate containers, such as you and I, right? Because as long as it's just that field, it doesn't really have any subject-object split. It's just, I mean, have people taken 5-MeO DMT? For me, that's a direct experience of that field, that underlying field or source field of consciousness, where it's non-duality, right? There's no split between subject object while you're in the most powerful part of that experience. I think that this analytic or monistic idealism is something that provides a logical and foundational ground for kind of like rethinking our world in a way. And a wonderful philosopher, if you have a notebook, you want to check this out, Bernardo Kastrup, he was a former scientist at CERN, and he's written a number of books. One of them is called Why Materialism is Baloney, Dreamed Up Reality. So he's a very good logical thinker, and he actually has an institute now in Holland called Essentia, which is essentially trying to seed analytic idealism into the mainstream academies, because there's been a lot of resistance. Like the mainstream academies are still, sort of wedded to materialism, physicalism, reductive materialism. This idea that consciousness is an accidental kind of epiphenomenon of brain activity that just emerged accidentally through physical processes and so on. Now, so if this idea of analytic idealism, is true, it allows for a lot of things and allows for us to think differently about a lot of things. So, for instance, it allows for psychic phenomena. Psychic phenomena would just make sense if the universe is consciousness experiencing itself. The possibility that we might have an aspect of our being that survives physical death would also make perfect sense if we're connected to the ground of consciousness in some maybe in some quantum way. In 2022, a Nobel Prize for Physics went to a group of scientists, physicists, who've discovered through repeat experiment that the universe is not locally real, which is still, I think, very hard for our minds to grasp. But essentially, if there's no observing, witnessing subject, there's energetic flux, but there's no fixed reality. That it actually requires the wave collapses to a particle when there's a subject making an observation, making a determined decision. It allows for this idea of there being maybe some aspect of ourselves that exists after death. Maybe it also allows for there being subtler levels or dimensions of reality, as we also might experience in psychedelic states like ayahuasca and DMT and so on. There's some great kind of evidence, let's say circumstantial evidence for reincarnation. There's this guy, Dr. Ian Stevenson, who wrote a number of books, including Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect. And he went all around the world finding children who had spontaneous past life recall. I think they aged between 5 and 8 often. And often he would be able to bring these kids, they would describe where they were from, and he would bring them to these other towns, maybe in India or wherever, Thailand. He would find the families that they said they were from, and there would be reunion, there would be sort of a recognition. And then often the kids would have significant birthmarks, they might have a big mark on the neck, and they would discover that the last life that they believe themselves to be associated with had died from a blow to the neck or something. And there's photo documentation and so on in that book. This idea of consciousness being the ontological primary or the basis could also allow us ways to think about, UFOs, extraterrestrial activity, stuff at the sort of liminal edge of reality that we keep encountering. So that for me is a very exciting development. And also, I think it has meanings for social structures, political structures, financial structures. So basically, it's very interesting in a way, this is what I was writing about this morning. The American Revolution was a big deal. We created this, flawed constitutional republic, this democracy. It sort of seems like with this sort of election of a despot, we have kind of we've passed through something. We've given up on this old constitutional republic. And, because he's been, Trump and his people have been very clear that they want a one-party rule. If you read the Heritage Foundation, Project 25 or something, they want to take us down a very different path. In a way, part of what, if you get into the Heritage Foundation, I just read the book by Kevin Roberts, who's the head of the Heritage Foundation, who drafted Project 25. In a way, it's a direct challenge to the Enlightenment tradition. They don't want use of public reason. They don't want free thinking. They don't want contraception. They certainly don't want abortion. They basically want a pious nation based on Christian ideas, where public prayer becomes incorporated into civic life. I don't know if you just saw, even in Florida, they've been burning all of these books right now, Native American histories, African American histories. So it's very much like a sort of Taliban-like project that's happening in the U.S. right now. And we can ask ourselves, why is this happening? Well, certainly, we can't be that very happy. I'm certainly not, with the Democratic Party and how that has developed over time in terms of, instead of providing recourse for working people, it ended up supporting, corporate, wealth and so on. So obviously people reached a level of frustration where they felt there was no recourse left in the system, and only given two choices, which was a party of the status quo or a party to destroy the system, they've chosen the latter, which in some ways is reasonable. I hate to say it, considering many different factors. But it's also, it's a dangerous situation. But at the moment, it's a situation also of chaos, crisis, and potentially opportunity. So I think it's important to register all of that in how we look at what's happening. Does this make any sense? Is this resonating with people at all? Yeah. Anybody have like a burning question or something that they feel like they want me to address? Yeah, please, yeah.
With the development, your thoughts towards like the idea of consciousness evolving into like a telepathic and known ether we tap into, is this like a technological integration, do you feel, or do you feel it's an organic evolutionary conscious process happening to us as we educate and kind of practice into different gifts or extrasensory perceptions aspect, or is the development of technology and all of these things that we're developing going to be integrated within us as a part of like a larger scale organic process? Because we think of like what we're developing as being man-made, but like the idea of it's organic, coming from nature, from us through our consciousness that we developed and we develop and adapt. So is it the singularity idea of like that emergence of connecting and tapping into it, is that a technological one, or can there be both? Or are we going to come to the idea, like you were saying, that we already have these capacities, so we don't need to scale this direction, because in a way, obviously, the cons to that is like the control aspect of what's.
Did everybody hear him, by the way?
Yeah. Like what's driving that, as opposed to our own sovereignty driving this organic process and gifts and extrasensory perceptions, kind of hacking into that. And is like that kind of seems like what's happening. It kind of seems like there's going to be this.
I think it's obviously we're in it, so it's hard to say exactly what it is and where it goes. Like we're just, we're part of this thing that's happening, that seems to be accelerating and so on. But it seems as if there's not really a dichotomy or duality, because the technologies of media and communications and all the other stuff is also part of how we develop the possibility of making a shift, a psychic and telepathic shift. I mean, just to give you one example, like last week there's a great documentary called Tukdam, Between Worlds. People heard of Tukdam? So apparently, Indo-Tibetan monks who've spent their whole lives meditating, some of them, when they die, after like 30 years of meditating, they sit in the lotus position straight up, and their bodies don't decay. And this can happen for days, weeks, or as long as like a month and a half or something. And scientists actually went around and they documented these cases, and the bodies can't be moved and so on. And you can see like days after, the body is still completely flexible, the skin is alive, but there's no pulse and there's no breath. And according to their understanding from that tradition, the monk is maintaining themselves in a subtle consciousness state, in a form of nirvana consciousness, while they choose their next incarnation. That's why you don't want to move the body, because you don't want to interrupt them. So that's like I wouldn't have seen the evidence for that if it wasn't for this film that required all of the technology to make the film and then to put it online and so on. So it's a question of how we make use of this technology, and if we make use of it in the time that we have to kind of re-engineer our own self-awareness of what's possible within consciousness.
On the other, one more comment as far as the idealism. Are you familiar with biocentrism as far as that being a complementary philosophy with things? It sounds very similar.
Robert Lanza wrote a book called Biocentrism, which is essentially the same argument. My friend Neil Teese also wrote a great book called Notes on Complexity, a complexity theory book, and he ended up, he started as a scientific materialist, he ended up as an idealist. Douglas Hoffman as a neuroscientist who's shifted over to the idealist perspective. So it does seem like it's a mini movement. I mean, then you also have on the sort of tech singularity or transhumanist side, people like Nick Bostrom who've become obsessed with the simulation hypothesis, which I think in a way is a technologically kind of like geeky engineering-ish way to talk about some of the same stuff. They're just putting it in their context, in their language. Anybody else have a question or thought? Yeah,
You said that we were in the sun for whatever 6,000 years.
the sun of light. Now we're in the sun of darkness, according to the Aztecs.
That's like the next 6,000 years.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, what that would mean is that, really mastering the shadow, really, really going deep into kind of like, because the danger of it is manifestation. So, the manifestations go wrong. I mean, actually, one thing that I think about as being quite fascinating is who is the most successful, like, occult practitioner in the world right now? Occult. Yeah. Why? Okay, I'll just tell you. I think it's Donald Trump. Donald Trump grew up in the church of Norman Vincent Peale. People know who he is? Norman Vincent Peale wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. So apparently Trump had like total ADHD, so he couldn't listen to anything, but he would sit rapt listening to Norman Vincent Peale for hours and hours. And if you read The Power of Positive Thinking, it's basically this. You can do basically anything you want as long as you deprogram your mind of any idea that you're not going to achieve that thing. So that's what Trump has done. Like whenever he talked about becoming president, there was no equivocation. Oh, I might win, I might lose. Back 20, 30 years, if I run for president, I will win the presidency. 2020, that's why he's like, made this thing. Like I won in 2020 because that's what he said happened. And he's actually, with his, crazy occult power, and I don't, like the guy or his policies, or I think he's a total corrupt grifter on so many levels. But he's bent reality to his will through this occult practice of the power of positive thinking. So what could we do? I mean, I don't know. Is there a way to use some of these tools to transform or transmute the situation on a kind of quantum level? Before we go down the tubes, because it does kind of look more and more like that's where we're heading. And obviously, like things don't change. When people are comfortable, like when you could go to Starbucks and get your, double frappuccino, strawberry mint latte, blah blah blah, you're just going to keep doing that, But when you can't go into the Starbucks because of the riots and the water's gone and so on, maybe finally you're like, oh, like, I got to try something else here, So it's almost like and I've thought about this for a long time, that on some unconscious level, humanity is like willing itself into a life or death crisis as a kind of initiatory threshold to bring about the possibility of our own transmutation as an idea. But what I want to really get at in terms of this type of community, and now it's really became clear to me over the last few days, it's like, I feel like a little bit in these communities, there's like this sort of kind of the paradigm or the ideology has been a kind of like sort of neo-animism, neo-indigeneity, kind of like neo, secret, neo, kind of like you pull in a little bit of Joe Dispenza, but there's also still a little bit of like materialism and neoliberalism and hyper-individuality and so on. I really think that to get through this threshold, and I'm more and more like feeling this, it's like we have to get a critical threshold of people to fully do the work to anchor themselves in this monistic idealism paradigm, because from that paradigm, possibly some kind of like transformation is doable, like a sort of quantum activism shift of some sort. But I think you have to go like all the way through it to get there, and maybe in that sense I'm like an early adapter. That's my theory at the moment.
Is there a mailing list we could sign up?
What do you mean?
To be in that movement?
Do I have a mailing list? I don't have a mailing list. I mean, please join my Substack. That's my communication arm. But yeah, whenever I come up with anything like that, I will put it out on the newsletter. So that's danielpinchbeck.substack.com. Yeah. So what I've left out, which I think is also interesting. So, but the idealism worldview, particularly when you incorporate it with some of the ideas from Rupert Sheldrake. Have people got into him at all? What's that? Yeah. Patterns of the past. So he's like a renegade English scientist who had a banned TED Talk. He wrote a book called The Science Delusion, where he critiqued the paradigm of kind of rational science from within the scientific paradigm. It was actually very brilliant. But he wrote a book about, morphogenetic fields, morphic resonance, this idea that kind of like patterns are held somehow in this sort of like quantum way. So he did some work on like animal telepathy and so on. But yeah, so like how is there enough information in like one cell to differentiate into the whole fetus and then the baby and so on? You know, he would argue that those formal patterns are somehow held in this, as morphogenetic fields. Maybe I'm not expressing this as well as I can sometimes, but what this allows us to think about is how you have local culture variation, right? Like when I visited the Secoya, there are certain types of magic that was practiced in that culture that was completely legitimate, and they all knew about it. But if I went to visit the Kogi or the Arawak people in Colombia, which I also did, they had systems of divination, tools, and it's almost like, so you have a human culture that's based in a local environment that over hundreds or thousands of years develops a sort of resonance with the locality, with the nature, with the plants, with the springs, with the rocks. It develops a language and a mythos kind of drawn out of that reciprocity, and within that morphogenetic field of that culture, things are possible which are impossible in maybe Western culture. And whereas there are things that are maybe slightly impossible in our culture, possible in our culture, which are impossible there. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Okay. So so that I think is very exciting, and that we can begin to understand why local cultures can have a kind of local magic or local way of being that's like quite distinct and quite different than what we have in the West. And it also, I think like once again to go back to Donald Trump. I think he's a big illustration. The whole thing where the assassination, where Trump's ear got nicked. Do you know how hard it would be to nick somebody's ear from like 50 yards away or whatever? It's like the ear is like this, the head is like this. You have all these people praying, all these fundamentalist fanatics praying for Trump. Well, what if that actually creates a morphogenetic field of protection around somebody like that? And so when the bullet, could have just gone right at him, it skeeters off in the last second. So what again, if there are these real psychic effects that we are observing in the world, we're just not really seeing them like that at this point. Because we don't have a rhetorical, linguistic, we don't have a logical framework for understanding how this could work. And that's kind of what I'm trying to offer you here today, if that makes any sense.
Hey, can you talk a little bit more? I'm just curious.
The hard questions are coming.
No. No, but thinking about Project 25 and that being a microcosm or a very larger growing demographic that has a certain impact, let's just say the manifestation powers of that could have a quite larger impact, and the majority of the population choosing a system that is set to destroy itself. Talk to me a little bit more about potential opportunities you touched on earlier. Maybe a little hope.
Yeah.
Can we go there?
Yeah.
Curious.
Well,
What are the plus?
she's looking for hope. I get it. Yeah. Well, first of all, it's very, I don't know if people have been observing the last few days, there's sort of cracks and fractures happening in the MAGA world right now, where it turns out that the tech billionaires want to be able to, cheapskate foreign immigrant labor, and the MAGA faithful like Steve Bannon are like, what the hell are you talking about? America first. White people need those jobs and so on. So that's the first like major crack, which I'm so happy. It's very good to see that, because the whole thing it's a very fragile alliance, and it could crack apart, which I think would create more space. My biggest fear personally is so basically, Trump and his people have been, meeting a lot with Viktor Orban from Hungary. And Orban took over society in Hungary, pretty efficiently. And one of the main ways you do that is by destroying freedom of the press, and you do that through lawsuits. So they already, ABC, immediately caved in and paid Trump $15 million. Now he's going after the Des Moines Register, but they have deep pockets. They could basically go after all of the free media, ish in the U.S. and try to tame it and domesticate it. So if they have internal, crises, that could really detain them for a while from pulling up some of these other things. Now, the U.S. is way bigger than Hungary. Hungary is like 10 million people. We're 300 million people in a federated system with states that have different individual rights and so on. What we might see is a kind of effort to kind of create a kind of totalitarian control system that actually has a lot of gaps and breaks in it, and sort of like the cracks in a pavement that allow for like weeds and flowers to grow. So that could be something like a movement of regenerative communities that are, networked together, that are, exploring regenerative practices, as we discussed today. As the mainstream MAGA thing ultimately breaks apart, as it's definitely going to do at some point, that other level of reality might be more coherent. There's an interesting, Christopher Botch wrote a book called LSD in the Mind of the Universe. He was a guy who did like tons and tons of high-dose LSD and so on. And he downloaded a whole prophetic vision over time around this happening. Essentially, there'd be a lot of hardship, things would get worse, but then ultimately this mycelial networks of new communities were going to form, and that would become the basis for like a new kind of authentic based culture for the future. So he saw short-term bad, long-term good. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just really curious, so this analytic idealism of the three perspectives, like where does that lead in terms of, I don't know, prediction or like using it as a tool or something? I mean, just as an example, like reductive materialism produces airplanes and iPhones and all this sort of stuff.
Right. I mean, so yeah. What I didn't get around to saying is reductive materialism is the basis for capitalist bourgeois materialist society over the last 2.5 centuries. Beginning with 1776, the American Revolution, leading till now. Materialism, like Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, that there's no transcendence, there's no absolute truth, there's only relative value, and so on. That still remains like the basis, of our kind of social system. And then ultimately, in a system where only materialism exists, then people are just prone to care about amassing material things, consumerism, possessiveness. Like those go along with a primarily materialist orientation. So if we were to shift to a primarily idealist orientation, we would be more understanding that everybody is an aspect of the same universal consciousness of equal value and equal worth, regardless of their skills or intellect or whatever. We wouldn't be as interested in accumulating material, because we would recognize that actually there's probably consciousness continuing in different dimensions, different ways, for infinity, and we're aspects of that larger consciousness, and actually we would be best served by using our incarnational kind of vehicle to bring about a better and more coherent shared reality for everybody, not just for the few.
So that addresses more like a value system as opposed to like what you can build on top of it.
It addresses the value system. What you could build on top of it is an interesting question. I mean, I think that there is a sense that beginning to articulate something also changes the reality in strange ways. Like I felt that very much in terms of psychedelics. My book Breaking Open the Head came out in 2002, and there were countercultures that were exploring psychedelics, but there was no possibility of them like breaking through into the mainstream. And then it was like we had a magazine that people started having experience, and ayahuasca got bigger, and people started talking about it, and there was Burning Man, and then suddenly like the field of awareness had been prepared, and then on top of that, the mainstreaming of psychedelics happened. In retrospect, I see that the problem was not also having a coherent, non-materialist paradigm connected to that, because in a way, psychedelics have been sort of absorbed into capitalism right now. Like it's the therapy paradigm, or it's either using to support the individual development, or creativity, innovation, corporate innovation, microdosing for innovation, and so on. So for me, the true value of the psychedelics is to help us shift this paradigm. And then, an interesting book, I'm always quoting books, I apologize for that, is The Psychedelic Future of the Mind by this guy, Tom Roberts. And he basically argues that, like the whole frontier of human development might shift from this idea of a technological singularity to what he talks about as a neurosingularity, where we become really interested in like the huge range of mind-body states that are possibly available to us in the future. And how we can use biofeedback or meditation or dark retreats or qigong or all these different practices to explore these different mind-body states that actually sometimes have different forms of knowledge natural to them, or different kinds of abilities that are natural to them. So yeah, we're just at the very, very beginning of what could be a very profound and amazing exploration. Personally, I find it much more interesting than the idea of settling on Mars, which is where Musk is trying to like push, using that as a way to push civilization towards a sort of techno-futurism in a way. Yeah. Even you were talking about your lightning strike yesterday. I mean, a lot of people get struck by lightning and develop like a new skill, like they learn a new language or healing power or something. Like we don't, the bioelectricity of consciousness. Like there's so much that we can discover and learn. Once we make this little bit of a shift in possibility, or paradigm. Okay, it's 1:32. So yeah, if you enjoyed this and you want to go more in, I know it's a lot to take in, and I sometimes get excited that I talk fast, so I apologize for that. Well, not for you, but you've been on this stuff for years now. So let's meet again in the afternoon, anybody who wants, and I'll give people more time to reflect and talk about this stuff. I want to talk a little bit about Rudolf Steiner, who's a Western esoteric thinker, who I also think helps us understand on a sort of cosmological framing, like what's happening in our civilization now. And I think it's, what I try to do with these different esoteric framings is like not just, see, they're like lenses. They're like ways to look at, the nature of what's happening. Not a question of like getting too embedded in any one worldview, then you end up as a fundamentalist again. But how you can use these different maps or models to help us navigate in this really crazy time that we're in. Which we all signed up for, I guess, or we all evolved into, or here we are in any case. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking more a little bit later.